To maximise your confidence and ride to the best of your abilities, you need to make sure your brakes are totally dialed. In this video, I'm going to show you how to tune your brake system to your riding style and local terrain and get them working as efficiently as possible. I'm going to be using SRAM's code system here, but most of the points I make are going to apply whatever brand of hydraulic brake system you're using. Code is SRAM's most powerful brake system, intended for enduro bikes, downhill bikes and e-bikes. To perform under the most extreme conditions, which include long descents at high speeds, it uses a 4-piston caliper and boasts a large volume of hydraulic fluid. So before we go any further, it's important to remember that a disc brake, or indeed any brake, works by converting kinetic energy or motion into thermal energy or heat. So heat is a vital part of any brake system, but too much of it or too little of it and the brakes won't work to their full potential. So on the one hand, we have the mechanical system, which has to be optimized to your bike and where you ride. The other part of the equation is you, so the biomechanics of operating the brake. Taking the time to get the brake lever in the best position for your fingers and hands will give you the ultimate confidence and control over the system. And that's where we're going to start this video. So the first thing we're going to look at is the position of the brake lever relative to the grip and therefore your hands. All hydraulic mountain bike brakes are designed to be used with just one finger. Now it doesn't matter whether you use your index finger or your middle finger, you want your braking finger to sit at the end of the lever just by the kink. This will stop your finger sliding around and give you maximum leverage. Now let's look at the angle of our lever. To a certain extent this is down to personal preference, but one tip worth considering is to run your brake levers at a fairly flat angle. Now what this lets you do is support your weight through your palms and your arms up into your shoulders rather than through your wrists. Now in turn this means you can reduce the tension in your hands and your wrists, which can improve control of the bike, and it can reduce arm pump on longer descents. And by flat I don't mean completely horizontal, but certainly less than 45 degrees. It might feel weird at first, but persevere and you may find it really helps your descending. Now with SRAM levers, it doesn't matter which lever you pull to actuate which brake, as the levers can be run on either side of the bar. The other two aspects of lever setup are reach and bite point adjustment. These two need to be approached in tandem, as a short reach won't work with a long lever throw. To a large degree, lever reach will depend on the size of your hand and the length of your fingers. Small hands will need the lever closer to the bar and large hands will need it further away. You can adjust this with the dial on the front or a hex key inside the lever. On some brake systems, such as this code RSC, you can also tune the bite point. This refers to the point in the lever travel where the pads contact the rotor. Too close and you might find the pads drag against the rotor all the time, which wastes energy and wears out your pads prematurely, and can also make the brake too sensitive, so the slightest tension on a rough section of trail might apply the brakes. But too far away and you might start crushing your knuckles with the lever before the brakes start doing anything. The pistons should self-adjust as the brake pads wear down, but if you feel the bite point coming closer to the bar, then it's worth doing a pad advance. Wind the bite point adjuster all the way out so the brake comes on when the lever is closest to the bar. Remove the wheel from the bike. Now pull the lever until the pads are around 1 mm apart. Put the pad spacer in and pull the lever a few times to set the pistons. Refit the wheel and check the bite point is where you want it and the pads are not dragging on the rotor. If your brakes feel spongy, in other words you can still pull the lever once the pads have hit the rotor, then your brakes are probably going to need bleeding. I'm not going to go into the details of that here, as there are loads of videos showing you how to do this. In fact, I've dropped a link to our own one in the video description. But suffice to say, it's not a difficult job to do at home if you have a work stand and a bleed kit. Just take your time and follow the instructions and you'll end up with sweet brakes, and you'll save yourself a load of cash versus taking it to a bike shop. Another incentive to buy the tools and learn how to do it is that most brake systems will need the fluid refreshing every 1 to 2 years. Now, just like in your car, the dot fluid in a mountain bike brake very gradually absorbs moisture, and water boils at a much lower temperature than brake fluid. Poorly maintained dot fluid brakes can lead to the lever feeling softer and the brake needing a bleed. But if you have a brake that uses mineral fluid, such as SRAM's new DB8 brake, then you'll notice longer periods between this required bleeding. But mineral oil does have some other limitations that makes it less effective in high performance applications. So with the brake lever adjusted, let's turn our attention to the caliper and the rotor. The first thing to do before we make any adjustments is to give it a good clean. It's worth wearing gloves here, as that will prevent the oils on your skin from contaminating the rotor. Use a brake cleaner spray and a workshop paper towel to get into all of the nooks and crannies. Check the pistons are retracting properly into the caliper and the lever is returning after you pull it. If it's at all slow or lazy, then you'll want to get all the pistons working as equally as possible again. Remove the wheel and pads and use some brake cleaner or brake fluid to lubricate the piston seals. Use a piston tool or some large plastic tyre levers to stop the pistons from being pushed out. Then pull the lever and work them back with the tool. Repeat this for a while, and when they are smooth and move freely, you can thoroughly remove the brake fluid with water or brake cleaner, let them dry off, then reinstall the pads. At this point, I'm going to state the obvious, but always be ultra careful not to get any lubricant or silicone-based cleaner onto the brake system when you're working on your bike. And that's why I would recommend a drip lube rather than an aerosol. And be really careful with something like a silicone spray, which is often used to lubricate your suspension seals or protect your frame, as it can go everywhere. Now is a good time to check your pads and your rotors. Now, your pads can be worn and your rotors can be buckled. If you can see black or purple scorch marks on the rotor spokes, you've cooked your brakes at some point, and it might be worth looking at ways of increasing the power. You can do this in a couple of ways without resorting to a new set of brakes. The easiest way is to increase the size of your rotors. A bigger rotor gives more mechanical advantage and also helps dissipate heat more effectively. So if you're running 180mm rotors, you could think about sizing up to a 200. Now, SRAM even makes a 220mm rotor now, which is really useful for controlling the extra weight of an e-bike. You'll need to check your frame is compatible first, and you'll have to buy new adapters, but it's still a really cost-effective way of increasing your braking power. It's also worth thinking about which brake is getting the most use. Most bikes have a larger front rotor and a smaller rear rotor, but on a long descent, it's always the back brake that gets cooked. That's because we tend to drag our back brakes when it's steep or fast, so they get really hot. So it might actually be worth equalising the size of your rotors if you do a lot of long descents. Now, SRAM also makes these HS2 rotors, which are slightly thicker than normal. They offer more bite and an increase in power due to the redesigned braking track. They also have different vent patterns and a heat dissipating paint on the spokes. But as they're thicker, you'll need to reset your pistons in the caliper to allow for the increased size. So overall, they're another good option worth considering if you're trying to manage heat without resorting to a larger, heavier rotor. Now let's look at the brake pads. There are two basic types on the market: metal sintered and organic. The brown looking ones are organic and the silvery grey ones are metal. Most performance mountain bikes run sintered metal pads. Why? Because they offer better performance and durability in wet conditions and on long descents. Organic pads, on the other hand, tend to be quieter and can offer better initial bite, but they don't tend to last very long in wet conditions. SRAM also offers something called a power pad, which claims to blend the properties of these two materials for a best of both worlds scenario. In certain conditions, even sintered metal pads can wear down in the blink of an eye. Welsh trail sensors in the rain are brutally tough on brake pads, for example. A larger rotor can also mean less brake pad wear, as you'll need less force to slow the bike down. Another important step in making sure your brake pads don't wear out prematurely is the bedding in procedure. Yes, it's a bit boring, but spending 5 minutes bedding in your pads will reward you with more power more durability and less noise. Just find a quiet piece of flat ground and brake from running speed to walking speed repeatedly until you feel the power come in. This procedure transfers a layer of material from the pad onto the disc rotor, so effectively there are two friction layers working together. Now if you're moving from a metallic pad to an organic pad, you will either have to buy new rotors or sand down the surface of your old rotors with an emery cloth before you start the bedding in procedure. This is not necessary if you're going from organic to sintered, however. My last piece of advice is to spend some time aligning your calipers and your rotors so that they run drag-free. There's no point wasting energy overcoming friction from your brakes when you don't need to. Now there are tools to help you get a good alignment, such as this wafer-thin butterfly tool, but I prefer to eyeball it. If you have something bright or white, put it on the floor under the bike, and this will make it easier to see the gap between the pad and the rotor. Loosen the caliper bolts so they're almost finger tight. Then move the caliper so that there's an even gap on each side. Hold the caliper tightly and just nip up the two bolts alternately, a bit at a time, until they're at the correct torque. Now spin the wheel and check it doesn't rub. So now we've got our brake setup completely dialed. Next time we hit the trail, we can slow down with absolute confidence. We won't be all tense and worried, and we can descend for longer without getting arm pump. I hope that's been useful, and let us know in the comments if you have any other tips we've missed. Thanks for watching.